Okay, we're going to get started, everybody. Thanks for coming. This is the next to last meeting of the Energy and Environment Forum. Thank you for being here. I'm Charles Sims. I'm the director of the Center for Energy, Transportation, and Environmental Policy here at the Baker School. If this is your first time here, this is our attempt to have a bit of an interdisciplinary conversation about energy and environmental issues. And so there's lots of places where you can talk to people on energy and environmental issues that think like you and probably studied similar stuff, and maybe you had the same professors. This is a chance for us to get out of our comfort zone a little bit and talk about this from a variety of disciplines. So I point that out now because if you're in the audience and you have a question about something that's not making sense and you think, well, maybe that's going to seem like a dumb question, it's not. That's part of what this is. We want to encourage people to ask questions that are coming from different perspectives that may seem a little bit out of left field at first, but usually spark some good conversation. So don't be nervous about asking questions. If you are online, so we should have a large number of people online. If you're online, make it a point to be here next time, but we're happy that you're here online. If you are seeing a feed into the Toyota Auditorium, you should be able to toggle your screen. So if you look on there should be a place to toggle and you can see some slides online. You'll want to do that before our speaker starts their talk today. If you're on a mobile device, it's a little harder to find sometimes, but just look for it. You all should also see at the bottom a little place, a little link that will take you to a document where you can enter your questions for the speaker. We'll collect those at the end of the presentation and feed those in. So we want the people online to be involved in the Q&A as well. And of course, for the folks here, we'll accept questions at the end as well and feed those up to Joe. Now, like I said, this is not the last meeting of the forum for the semester. So next week we will have Rua Mordecai from the Southeast Conservation, who is the Southeast Conservation Blueprint Coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The title of his talk is The Southeast Conservation Blueprint, Lessons from 10 Years of Collaborative Spatial Planning and Action. So landscape, biodiversity, conservation topics for next week. So make it a point to put that on your calendar. If you like the conversation today and you like what we're doing here, I would encourage you to sign up online for our mailing list. We already have speakers lined up for next semester, and you'll want to make sure you don't miss those. If you're a graduate student and you are interested in these types of topics, I would encourage you to talk to either me or Dr. Paul Armsworth. We run a reading group every semester in conjunction with this seminar series. The purpose of the reading group is to have graduate students talk about these issues with one another and have conversations with people who don't think like you or don't actually have the same disciplinary background. So it's a great opportunity for you to convey your research to a very smart but non-expert audience, and to also figure out how you can interpret information that's being fed to you by other experts. Okay, so we do this all the time. We put you in a bubble while you're here at the university, and you talk to people like you all the time, and then we throw you out into the world, and we expect you to communicate with others, and it's hard. So we'll give you a little bit of a taste on how to do that. But if you're interested in that, talk to me or Dr. Armsworth, and we can get you set up with that. Okay. Now, our speaker for today is going to give you a bit of a preview of something that I want to point out, which is our new energy policy certificate. Okay, so we have created some new graduate certificates here at the Baker School. There's several of them, and these are designed for students who may be getting a degree in a different discipline, so maybe not policy or public policy, but that want a little bit of policy tacked on to their graduate degree. Okay, so if you're engineering, for instance, you're doing nuclear engineering, energy policy might be a nice add-on to your degree. So it's require 9 to 12 credit hours for completion. There is if you scroll down here on our website, there's an energy policy certificate. There are 3 required courses here: administrative law and regulatory policy making, energy markets and economics, and energy policy, which is taught by our own Tim Fitzgerald here, who worked in the White House and the Council of Economic Advisors on a lot of the topics that you'll be going over in class, so you should have firsthand experience. And then Joe Hoagland, who will be teaching energy transitions, HBS 543. Okay, so this is going to give you a bit of a preview for what that might look like. So if you get to the end of this and you're like, man, I really wish I had another hour and a half or 2 hours of that, Joe wants you in his class because you're the exact person that he wants to talk to in that class, okay? So if you have any questions about that, please reach out to me and I can connect you with the right people to talk about the certificate and the possibilities. There's also undergraduate concentrations and graduate concentrations in this as well. So regardless of what degree you're at or what level you're in, we can find something for you here that will be around energy policy, okay? So with that, I want to welcome our speaker for today. So Joe Hoagland is the Vice President of Innovation and Research at the Tennessee Valley Authority. We all know what the Tennessee Valley Authority is, but you may not know it's the largest public power provider in the country. He has over 30 years of experience shaping the direction of the power sector. He currently leads a team of probably some of the most interesting stuff that's going on at TVA, I will say. A team that conducts transformational research and manages innovative projects at TVA's power system of the future. An effort to meet shifting consumer and business power demands without compromising reliability, resiliency, and customer service. He and his team are also exploring cost-effective carbon reductions with new forms of generation and the electrification of the broader economy that includes advances in electric transportation, solar power battery storage, and advanced nuclear generation technologies. Okay, so there's basically a group of people at TVA that keeps the light on, and there's Joe's group that's thinking about what are we going to do tomorrow, how are we going to respond to this challenge, how are we going to adapt the system, kind of all the stuff that you would see in a classroom where we're thinking through what's going to happen in the future. Joe's kind of the sandbox that tests out all of what those future changes at TVA might need to look like, okay? Joe is also an adjunct professor of energy policy at the Baker School, the chair of the state of Tennessee's Energy Policy Council, a member of the board of directors of the Smart Electric Power Association, and recently was chair of the Electric Power Research Institute's Executive Resource Advisory Committee. And with that, join me in welcoming Joe Hoagland.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Great to see everybody today. So, yeah, Charles, thanks for the introduction. Every time I hear that bio, I'm like, I got to make that thing shorter.
I cut it down.
So I want to talk a little bit today about the fact that the energy system is transitioning. And what does that mean? Now, I'd like to be able to tell you by the time we get done today exactly how we're going to do it, what that looks like. But what I'm actually going to tell you today is how complex this problem really is and what you have to really think about, particularly if you're worried about the policy to help change things. And I'll get more into that. But I want to start first and talk about energy. Oh, okay, that works. All right, so for my background, I'm actually a physicist and a chemist, so I had to put a math equation up here somewhere, right? So start off with one of my heroes, Einstein, right? E equals mc squared is really a fascinating equation because at the end of the day, what it means is that energy and matter are effectively one and the same thing, and they translate from one another, right? And that's one of the things that Einstein figured out. Why do we care about that? Well, we care about that because what that really means is that everything we do, whether it's life, whether it's manipulating our environment, involves energy. And it involves energy and transitioning back and forth one way or another. That's obvious, right? Well, the amazing part is when I go around and talk to people, it's not obvious. People don't actually understand that everything they do in their life involves energy. And that energy has to come from somewhere, has to be converted into something, and has to do some sort of work. So when you start talking about the energy system and you start talking about how we want to change the energy system and the implications, there's often a lack of understanding about exactly what is it energy does for you on a daily basis, right? And so when I think about that, I always come back to Einstein and go, well, like pretty much everything, right? You can't exist without it. So let's talk, and we could talk about a lot of different ways to look at energy, but I'm going to zero into Tennessee for a minute and talk a little bit about what does energy in Tennessee look like outside of sort of the biological processes, but the things that we do to manipulate our environment. And this is what's called a Sankey diagram. It's actually a pretty cool diagram that shows you how energy, where it comes from, what its sources are, and then how it gets used. And so, do I have a pointer on here? Yeah, there we go. Okay. So just to give you an example. So for the state of Tennessee, in British thermal units, this gives you a sense of each kind of fuel that we use within the state, right? So everything from solar power all the way down to petroleum. And think of petroleum primarily as gasoline that goes into your cars. And then when you look at these bars that goes across here, that's an indication of the magnitude of how much of that particular fuel goes into something, right? So, for example, electricity generation, right? So solar goes into that, nuclear, hydro, wind. You'll notice we don't in the state have any geothermal in there. Natural gas does, coal, biomass, and even a little bit of gas, right? All goes into producing electricity. Likewise, many of these resources don't go to electricity, but they go directly to either a residential sector, think about where you live, commercial sector, that's places like Walmart and all that kind of stuff. Industrial, be big steel plants and those kind of things, and of course the transportation sector. And then on the outside of that, you also find out, look at this great big thing over here. That's how much energy doesn't get used, right? That's waste. So we use a lot of energy, we create a lot of energy, but a lot of energy actually just kind of goes out and doesn't get used, right? Most people think when you first talk to them, whatever we created the energy, right? It all gets used up. Well, it doesn't, right? Overall, and you can see with electricity production in particular, that's a big number of what comes out of there. Well, and if you think about how we generally make electricity from any of those sources, it's really a simple process that we've been doing for over 100 years, right? We take something, a fuel, we burn it, we make something hot. That something hot we use to boil a fluid, usually water, and then that water turns to steam, and we take that steam and push it through a turbine, right? There are a few exceptions to that, but for the most part, that's how we operate it. In fact, utility guys, what we say is we are experts at spinning hot metal. We know how to do that really well, been doing it for over 100 years. But in that process, we lose a whole lot of that heat, right? So when you see the big steam clouds coming out of power plants, that's that extra heat. It's not pollution, it's extra heat that's coming out of there. All right. Well, the important part though, now that you kind of got maybe a little bit of orientation on this, is to give you a sense of how many different sources of energy we have, how much it's used, and how much it interplays with one another, right? It's really important to note that because one source of energy doesn't produce everything. One source of energy, and the amounts that are in each of these are huge. I mean, look at how much goes right here, and that's all about driving cars and trucks for the most part, right? That's almost more energy than we put in all the rest combined. You can go online, and I'd encourage you, if you find this interesting, and go look. You can look at different states, you can look at the U.S., you can look at all kinds of places and understand how people do things and change things different. If I take this, though, and I translate it into energy for the state of Tennessee, so let's just look at electric generation, because that's what I want to really focus on today, is electricity generation. In the state of Tennessee, this gives you the idea, the sense of where it comes from and how much. So most of the electricity comes from electric utilities. In Tennessee, that's actually TVA is where most of the electricity comes from. We do have a number of companies that have their own generation, generally in the form of either natural gas or combined heat and power. Combined heat and power means that they do what I said before. They burn something, run part of it through a generator to make electricity, and they take that waste heat, so this is actually a good thing, and they use that heat for something in their processes. So they're actually a little bit more efficient. But everything that happens in the state is effectively dependent upon what happens right there. If that doesn't work, remember back to the first slide, nothing else functions very well. I didn't know I had animation. Look at that. Okay. So how do we get that to people? We get that to people, that energy, through a grid system that has large generators, goes to a transmission system, which think about that as the really high voltage power lines. So you think the great big towers that you see when you're driving up and down the road. Those go to a distribution system, which are the lines you see around here, and then come out to your home. We've been working on that system since the beginning of the 20th century, right? You think, go back to Edison and Tesla and trying to figure out how to bring power to people's homes and businesses. So we've been refining this system for a really long time. And it's a fairly straightforward system. But the reality is it's one of the most complicated machines man's ever built, right? So if you think about the big power generators, all that metal spinning I talked about, and then you think about the grid system to translate this, and you're using 60-cycle AC electricity. Those of you who are familiar with electrical circuits and that kind of stuff knows that's really complicated, right? And so even though this picture looks simple, it's a really complicated system to make operate all the time. The other thing that's interesting about electricity is up until very recently, electricity was something that had to be used on demand. So what I mean by that is think about electricity, right, as a commodity. But it's a commodity that you produce and sell, and you have to use it the instant you produce and sell it, right? So if you think about any other commodity there is, right, usually I can produce it, I can put it in a warehouse somewhere, and then when I'm ready to sell it to a customer, I can sell it to a customer. Electricity doesn't work that way. I have to use it or produce it and use it at exactly the same time. So the big challenge for electric companies is all those generators that they have to be running in such a way that they're meeting your needs every time you flip a switch, right? And they don't, and remember, all this was all developed before you guys ever come up with computers or anything like that, right? So they had to be able to figure out how to make this system work where there was always energy being produced at the instant you wanted to change the energy that you were using, right? And they figured out how to do that really well, right? And figured out how to do that without necessarily computer systems. Now today we have computer systems, makes it easier, allows us to do things in a much better way, but things are changing. I spent a lot of time here because this thing was really easy to manage, but complicated. We got to change this, but we're going to talk about now what are we going to change this to. So now this is what we want to change this to. And by the way, that other one took 100 years to get to the level of refinement, right? If we think about, and I'll talk more about this as we go along, the pressures of climate change and other things, we want to go to this system, right, in like maybe a couple of decades or sooner. So really hard. Now, what is this telling you? Well, somewhere in here still is, you still see the power plant, still see the substation, distribution system, right? You got residential, commercial, but now I have something completely different, right? I've got things like electric vehicles in there. I've got solar panels that might either be up here at the large scale or they might be down on individual businesses. I got batteries that might be in there. I've got all kinds of sensors and electronics that might be used. And all of us as consumers actually want to think about how we use energy differently, right? So for example, how many in here want coal in their mix? Okay, there's a few, right? How many of you want solar in your mix? Right? How many of you only want solar? Oh, that's good. Sometimes I usually get them that they only want solar, right? The reason I say that's good is that's really hard to do. But the point being, people actually care about where their electricity comes from, exactly how it's getting used and why it's getting used. They didn't used to care about that. All they used to care about was when I flipped the switch, did the light come on? And when I get my bill once a month, was it too expensive? Right? Now they're beginning to care a lot more about that. And now I want to be able to use it for other things. I want to charge my car, right? And well, everybody, I was going to say everybody, I'm assuming, has got a cell phone, right? But your whole life now revolves around the phone and your computer. Well, none of that works without electricity, right? So you got to have all that in order to be able to. And oh, by the way, all that stuff requires electricity that's really good, right? It can't be, we call it dirty, but it can't have frequency variations and all kinds of stuff because the electronics don't like that. So it has to be done really well. On top of that, because of what I just said about electronics and electric vehicles and all that kind of stuff, we're getting a lot of growth, right? Now, this is a picture out of TVA's most recent integrated resource plan that's out on the street. Shameful plug. If you haven't looked at it and you care about energy resource stuff, you ought to go look at it. It's on the website. We would appreciate any input or comments that anybody has. I think we have a few more weeks of public comment period. But what you see here is they've run a number of different cases trying to understand how the world evolves. So whether the economy really takes off, the economy's depressed, whether there's a strong regulatory environment or not a strong regulatory environment, that it changes the amount of growth. But the point I want to make here today is, well, okay, we could go effectively flat by 2050, or we could have a CAGR of almost 2.3%, which almost doubles the amount of energy that we have to produce and sell to people. And in our world, 2050 is not very far away. And I say that because, again, we built this system over 100 years. Well, when you build these things, we build them really big, and they're really expensive. Now, they last a long time, so we amortize that cost over a very long time, and that's what keeps costs low to people. But they also take a really long time to build. If I decide to go to build a big plant today, some of the fastest, like a gas plant, for example, is as much as 24 to 36 months. And that's if everything is ready to go, right? If I've got to do still environmental work, I don't have a pipeline available, I can go up to 5 years. If I want to build a new nuclear plant, I'm talking probably 10 to 15 years. If I want to build even a solar farm nowadays, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 48, 50 months. So we think 2050 is not very far away, especially if I got to almost double what we're trying to do. So this now becomes a pressure on that picture that I was talking about, because not only do I have to change the way the picture looks, I got to make it a whole freaking, sorry my French, but it's got to get a whole lot bigger than it is now. All right. Okay, well, why? Well, a lot of really cool stuff going on, right? Electrification is one. So if we want to decarbonize, it's becoming very clear to folks that the best way to decarbonize is to electrify processes in general. Because I can decarbonize a power plant, create decarbonized electricity, and that allows me to run my operation. It's also, in a lot of cases, a lot more efficient and a lot more easy with today's modern technologies for industrial processes to operate off of electricity, partly because of the digital nature and the fact that things have to be much more carefully controlled in operation. So that's one. Oh, and I should mention in there, besides all that stuff, is electric vehicles, right? So we move toward electric vehicles, both as private vehicles, but even more importantly, as you start thinking about large-scale truck transportation, trains, airplanes, all that stuff, they're going to be big electricity users. Second thing is data centers. These have been around for a while, but they're growing, and they're starting to grow really fast. Everybody in here uses the cloud, I think. Is there anybody that doesn't use the cloud? Maybe Jim. Jim might not use the cloud, but everybody else probably uses the cloud. And that cloud actually means somewhere it's really not the cloud, right? Everybody knows that, I hope. But there's a data center somewhere that is housing all of that data. And they are big energy users. Now, does anybody know why they're big energy users? Keep it cool. So guess what? They're also not efficient. Remember that big gray bar I showed that showed all that waste heat? Data centers are like king in that category. Because what happens is all your data goes in there into all those electronics, right? And all those electronics get hot as the electrons are moving around. Well, electronics don't like to be hot, right? They quit working if they get too hot. So it's all about now cooling. So if you go to a data center, you'll see, all the computer banks, but then you'll have something that's almost the size of the data center itself that's nothing but air conditioners or heat exchangers of some sort in order to be able to get the energy out of there. And they're growing like crazy. Oh, yeah, I mentioned the electric vehicles. That's growing like crazy. And now here's the new one. And this one is really almost creating a whole nother step change, which is AI. So it turns out, remember I just described how a data center worked. It turns out that when you're storing data and you're pulling data back out, yeah, it creates heat, but not that much. I think this is probably my problem with my brain, what I'm about to say, but when you actually now put AI in there, you're doing computation, right? You're actually doing the mathematics. That now takes a whole lot more energy, creates a whole lot more heat. I think my brain has the problem, it overheats. But the end result is now they're even bigger data users by a huge amount. So where data centers we've been seeing and we thought were really big when people come and said we got a 300 or 400 megawatt data center, and we were really impressed. These people are now talking, once they get this up and running, they're talking gigawatts, so thousands of megawatts. Now, our whole system is 36,000 megawatts. So if I had 36 AI units, right, I got our whole system, if you believe where they're going. Now, one thing I want to caveat here, they're still trying to figure this out. And there's a war going on, right? Because the one who figures out AI will be the next Apple, right? They're going to be the next super giant in charge of everything computer company. So they are all fighting as hard as they can to get there. And so they're all speculating. And so they're all building these things. How long it'll last, how much the growth will be, we don't know. But they need the power now. So all of these things are effectively disrupting and changing that load characteristic that I described on that last page. All right. And then, besides the disruptors, on the other side of this coin, we have all, I think, come to the realization that we have got to clean up the environment. We have got to reduce the carbon footprint, right? We've got to do things in a much cleaner way. We've got to implement technologies such as solar and wind and other clean technologies in order to continue to reduce that carbon footprint. As I already mentioned, changing customer demands. And we have a regulatory environment, and I'll talk more about this in a few minutes, but that is changing very dramatically all the time. Most utility people now are at the point of, I actually almost don't care what your regulations are as long as you will just leave them alone, right? Because I remember I said it takes a long time to build stuff, takes a long time to run stuff. I can't change regulatory requirements every 4 years and be productive. That's very difficult to operate in. So we need some level of consistency. All right. So I've talked a little bit about the fact that I've got this sort of simple grid that's changing into a more complicated grid and some of the drivers that are happening. So let's talk just for a minute about the technical part of the grid. I'm going to spend a lot of time here today. I can get down into the weeds here and get lost. So I'm just going to, main point I want you to come away with on this chart is the technical complexity of the grid is changing astronomically in terms of what has to be done. So if you think of that first picture I showed, here's your generator, transmission, distribution, user, right? Real simple, straightforward. Well, what's happening now is, first of all, in the old system, power was generated here and it flows all the way down here and gets used, right? Now, because I have things like solar panels and distributed generation and distributed storage, I now have what we call bidirectional power flow, which fancy way to say the power now also flows this way. Well, the grid wasn't really made for that. The grid really wasn't made for the power to go in the other direction. So we're trying to have to figure out how do we manage that. And it's important for two reasons. One, the physics of the system has to be managed when the power is coming in a different direction. Secondly, from a safety standpoint, right? For us in the utility industry, safety is important beyond everything else because the reality is this particular commodity will kill you if you get it, interact with it in the wrong way. So this bidirectional flow is doable, but it's a challenge. As I mentioned earlier, we got to have cleaner generation. We got to have renewables at large scale. We got to have batteries at large scale. Batteries, they're coming on fast. There's been a lot of great development in batteries, but again, it's about scale. So there's been a couple of utilities who've gone out and put in some really big lithium-ion batteries in the last few years. In fact, one of them out in the west, Arizona Public Service, put in 4 plants. Within 3 months, burned 3 of them to the ground. Because it turns out, and I think we're all understanding this better, but lithium batteries are great, but lithium has a very narrow window in which it likes to be in terms of temperature exposure. And when you get outside that window, it's really hard to stop it. And so got to think about that. How do we deal with different kinds of batteries? How do we make those safer? People want to make microgrids. What's a microgrid? Well, microgrid is, I'm going to turn my neighborhood into its own grid. So it's got its own power, it's got its own distribution, right? All of that, and I can isolate it from the power system so I can run it by myself. Well, that's a really cool idea, and it's probably got some real value, both in carbon reduction and the way it gets used, but they're expensive and they're difficult to integrate into the bigger system, right? And I'm not going to cover all of these, but, we're looking at alternate fuels. I do have to say this, because this just happened. TVA had the world's largest burn of renewable diesel last week in one of our power plants. So we took a company that makes renewable diesel. Long conversation about what renewable diesel really is, but basically this is diesel made out of, in this case, corn. Not corn itself, but corn stalks. And we burned it, worked great. So everybody says, oh, well, it doesn't produce CO2. Yeah, it produces CO2, right? It's diesel fuel. The theory is, if you look at it on the bigger scale, right, that the CO2 that goes up in the atmosphere goes back into growing corn, and then you take that corn and you make diesel fuel. So it's kind of cycling, right? I'm not fully convinced maybe that that's true, but it's a step in the direction of trying to figure out how to do some of that. Anyway, the point being is what used to be pretty straightforward for a utility to think about, now have to think about all of these things. And we have to do it while at the same time not letting the lights go out as things move along. All right. Now, I get asked a lot about, well, why don't we just do that, right? Let's begin to put all those pieces together and make that happen. And the answer is, yeah, it's a good idea. The challenge is multifold in the way that the systems and utilities have been developed in the United States. So first of all, when you think about power companies in the United States, there's a whole lot of them, and they're all different. So you have privately owned, IOUs might be a term that you've heard, independently owned. So they're for-profit companies that produce power, transmit the power, sell the power. You've got public power companies Those think about like large co-ops that you would think in the Midwest. We've even got co-ops here in our service territory, but those are owned by local communities and membership, and they operate. You've got federal public power, which is what TVA is. You've got independent power producers, so they don't care about the grid. All they do is generate power, and they send that power to you. You've got a market operator, so they're the opposite. They don't care where the power comes from. They create a market, and you bid your price of your power plant into their market. And if they buy it, they'll take your energy and distribute it. And then you got regional transmission operators that all they do is manage transmission systems, right? And all of these things intermingle and commingle with each other. Even here in the Valley, Tennessee does TVA, we generate it and we transmit it. But there's 153 distribution companies in the Tennessee Valley that we sell the power to and that goes to your homes. And each one of those power companies has their own business model, has their own regulatory oversight, has their own board of director and management structure. Some of them are part of the city, some of them are not, some of them are their own thing and part of the city, right? Anybody in here from Memphis? Memphis is probably one of the most confusing places of all from because they're part of the city, but they have their own board, but they report to the city council board. So they have a board meeting in MLGW and they decide what they're going to do. And then they have to go across the street to the city council board and do the whole thing over again because the city council has to also approve what they're doing. The point of all that is to just simply say from a policy standpoint, let's go do this is really hard because it's just a really complicated network. And then on top of that, when you start saying, well, okay, let's just go to the regulators for the power companies, that'll be easy. I hear this all the time. Just get FERC to do this. Okay, well, let's start with this. So first of all, here is your FERC regions. So while FERC has general oversight, each of those regions have their own independent. And oh, by the way, TVA is federal government. We don't fall under FERC. So we do our own thing. These are what's called the NERC region. So FERC is about markets and pricing and all that kind of stuff. NERC is about safety and about is the grid operating well. Well, you see those two things don't line up on top of each other. So you have intermixing different regulatory bodies. And then, as I mentioned before, each of the investor-owned, cooperative, and public-owned, they all each have their own structure, right? So if you think about IOUs, you've probably heard the word PUC, Public Utilities Commission. Well, they go to a Public Utilities Commission. That might be a state organization. It might be a municipal organization, depending on the city. And they all have to go to them for a regulatory. So if anybody wondered how big all of our utility legal departments are, they're really big. Because we spend half our time just trying to figure out how all these pieces work and go together. All right, and then this one. This is the one that really is hard. So because energy is so important, because it interacts with so many different things, that political interest and political direction is really strongly, is wrapped up very strongly in the electric system. So, perfect example, right? We've been working now for the last 4 years under the current Biden administration, where their focus has been very much moving toward cleaner energy, moving toward electrification, electric vehicles, all that kind of stuff, right? Well, we're not even 48 hours, are we, out of the election, and we're already here, and we're getting rid of all that. We're not going to do any of that anymore, right? Now, whether that's true or not, it's a different. There's some nuances in there. But the point being is, now that we've had a shift in the ideology of the politics, the focus at which we now have to put on things is going to change. And we have to figure out how to respond to that. And when I say we, I don't mean TVA in general. I mean the utility industry all the way across. We have to figure out. And what I've reflected here is the politics at a national level, but you have to think politics at a local level. You have to think politics at a state level. And then you got to think about advocacy. So you've got environmental groups who want to go in a particular direction, oil and gas industry that want to go in a particular direction, right? And so you have to balance all of those in this. All right. Does everybody's head hurt? It should. Now here's the real challenge. Remember, I've said a bunch of times, it took us 100 years to build this thing. So I got to take all those drivers and all those complexities, and I got to make a change to a system who, quite frankly, doesn't want to change. And there's some good reasons for that, right? Nobody in here, I don't think, wants your lights to go out, right? We want electricity on, operational all the time. So that means any decision we make, we are very conservative in how we make that decision, because anytime we take a high risk, there's a high potential you'll lose the lights. So we're very skeptical about that. Also, remember I said safety is our number one priority. Well, if I'm doing all kinds of new, cool, innovative, technical stuff, right, chances of me having a safety issue go up significantly. So like at TVA, my team's job is to come in and say, hey, we need to try this new, cool, newfangled stuff. And what our first reaction we usually get from the operations people is, whoa, wait a minute. We can't mess with that, right? Because it'll either mess up the system or somebody might get hurt. So we're dealing with a system that has a whole lot of inertia in it. I'll also say part of that inertia is back to all those political drivers and all those things. You create an environment around yourself where you try to insulate yourself from that. So it's really easy just to block change out and keep it out of the way. And so as a result, we tend to stay very much status quo. And that's worked, actually, quite well for a very long time. However, that's not where we're at now. Everybody wants something different, right? Where we have always thought about in our industry that development of technology and deployment of technology could take decades, right? The way technology is being developed and deployed nowadays, right? Sometimes it's less than a year. I have a quick story. So hopefully everybody knows that Elon Musk is bringing XAI to Memphis. And they're putting in a new supercomputer. I think they're going to call it Colossus or something like that. And they chose the location they were going to put this computer in less than 9 months ago. So here we are 9 months later. They have a fully operational 4-node supercomputer that's being trained as an AI, 150 megawatts of gas generation on the ground, set up and operational, 50 megawatts of battery storage set up on the ground and operational. They got out of the permitting process with the state because they treated it as an emergency operation because we don't have enough power at that location at this point. So they don't have to have a permit to run their gas generators for 365 days, and they're up and running. For a normal utility and for a normal economic development project, what I just described to you would easily be a 2-year project, right? Well, that's not how businesses are thinking today, right? They're changing the mode, and that means we have to adapt to it. But as I told you, it's a very difficult thing for us to be changing to. The other interesting thing in all of this, remember I said this is the most complex machine that's ever been built. Well, we get new market entrants that come in on any part of the system, right? I got a newfangled generator of some kind, solar panel. It's not newfangled, but a solar panel, right? I want you to put a whole bunch of solar on the system. And then they get mad when we can't just put a whole bunch of solar on the system. Well, the reason we can't is all the things I've been describing. It's not that they don't like solar. It's that there's a lot of complexities that are involved, everything from the technical issues in the plant to the policy issues to the regulatory issues that all have to be sorted out before you can put it in. And then, when you think about all those regulators I showed and the way they work, regulators generally don't work fast. That's not generally in their definition. And the business models that we've all developed don't work very well. So all of these things have now got to be thought about and have to be addressed. And they have to be addressed together. And if you take anything out of here today, that's one of the most important things, is that if you want to make changes to this really complex machine, you have to make technical changes, yes, for sure. But you got to make the policy changes, you got to make the cultural changes, you got to make the regulatory changes, and they all have to some degree, change together. Because if they don't, you run into all the problems we're running into now, right? We're not deploying solar enough. We're not cleaning up the grid enough. We're losing reliability on the grid. We can't meet load growth. Most of those things are happening because all of those things are not lining up together. All right, so last thing. Here's a perfect example. So, nuclear. It's taken a while, but I think everybody has figured out that it actually is carbon-free. And we need to do more nuclear. The problem is, nuclear is extremely expensive. It's very hard to deploy from its regulatory standpoint. And it takes a long time to build. So we're trying to figure out, how to do that. And so some of these same hyperscalers, the folks involved in the AIs, right, they need all this power. So they're like, hey, we'll build a nuclear plant. We think that'll be a great idea. Or we'll take one of the old nuclear plants that have been either mothballed or in the process of mothballing, and we'll refurbish it. And we'll put that in place, right? Great idea. And I'm actually in support of trying to figure out how to make that work because, as I said there, they bring money to the table. It helps. But one that's FERC yesterday or day before, sometime this week, actually had a project where they were going to take a unit that they were retiring out of a nuclear plant, and they were going to refurbish that unit, and they were going to give all the power supply to that unit to one of these new AI data centers. So because of remember I said everybody has a different jurisdiction. So the jurisdiction this was in, they had to go to FERC, and FERC had to say this was okay. Now why? Well, because they wanted the power from that power plant just to themselves, right? Which is not the way the grid's built. When you take power from a power plant, it goes to everybody. And you manage the system that way, you manage costs that way, and quite frankly, you socialize the costs that way. That's how we can afford to pay for this really complicated, expensive system. We all pay a little bit. Well, so when FERC looked at that, what FERC said was exactly that. Well, you can't prove that you're not going to make all these other people who are getting no benefit from that electricity, you're going to make them pay for it. And you can't prove that the way the wires and the way this was configured won't actually hurt the stability of the grid in that region. And the reason I say this is a perfect example is because this is a great idea. Trying to figure out how this to do. But you got to line up the technology, you got to line up the policy, and you got to line up the regulatory all together if you're going to make this happen. Because while the hyperscaler here is really interested in helping the utility industry, remember what I said a minute ago, they're interested in making billions of dollars on being the next successful AI person. So they have their own monetary motivation. So that's in this. Politics are in this. The utility is probably fighting this a little bit because the utility really would rather run the power plant and sell the power back to the hyperscaler, because that helps them reduce their costs to everybody else. And if they're an IOU, they make money, right? And you have to worry about the reliability of the system. So all of those things need to come together. And what I'm kind of where my head is after 30 years of being in this business and working in this space, this is kind of what I figured out, which is why I'm actually super excited to be here at the Baker School and teach a course, is we really do have to change this power system. But if you're going to be in a position, whether you're putting out new technology, whether you're creating a new part of the grid, whether you're going to be writing policy associated with it or figuring out the business model and the economics associated with it, you need to know how all the parts work. Because if you only know how one part works, you're going to get it wrong. And I think that's a lot of what we're struggling with right now in trying to move this transition forward, is we got a lot of people that know a part, but we don't have people that know the parts and can make decisions that actually help bring all the things together for a real solution. And I think, and then my unshameful plug for, if you think this is interesting, come to the class, because we'll dig into each one of the things I talked about here in a whole lot more detail, and give everybody an opportunity to maybe think through some of this for themselves. So with that, happy to answer questions.
So Joe, just to lead off, so when I first started talking to you about this issue 10 years ago, 11 years ago, there were a lot of what you have in here right now in this slideshow was not there, right? And none of that had happened. So I think my whole take on this has been just how much has changed in the past 11 years from where we used to be to where we are now. And so to me, the thing that we run into a lot is still thoughts about what this system looked like 15 years ago or even 12 years ago that are just not consistent with where we're at today, right? It's a very different system. We're facing very different challenges with the system. But as you said, the challenge seems to be that there's so many things happening at once and so many things changing at once that it's hard to really dig in and get a feel for it. So you have sufficiently conveyed to everyone in the room how challenging it is, but for the students in the room that are trying to figure out a way to get into this area and try to make a difference, what are the places that you see that are shifting most quickly, that need some more smart people thinking about them, and what are the places that are stuck that need to get unstuck?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, and I'll cover it two ways. I think on the technical side, the grid is, as I showed, it's diversifying and it's decentralizing. So where you had all these big power plants and, it ran out, well, what you now have is you've got all these technologies on the other side. And those technologies have to integrate together and operate. So the technologies themselves, the distributed technologies, but then in particular the computer technologies that goes along this. This is quickly evolving into a data scientist's dream world here, because we've got to collect a lot of data. We have to figure out how to interpret that data and then make decisions that can then feed effectively AIs or other computers that are operating the system. This system is going to be too complicated soon for a manual operator to be operating things. So from a technical side, certainly. And then if you get way down deep technical, if you're into materials science, if you're into electrical engineering, any of those kind of things, those are going to be crucial going forward. Now, the other side though, and I didn't talk about this today, because if I talk about that, you'll all be here for another 2 hours. And that is, how do I plan for this, right? So an IRP, Integrated Resource Plan, TVA's done them over the years. I've ran the last few of them, not this one, but they were simple relatively, right? Because really what you were thinking about in an Integrated Resource Plan is, well, I got this load and I have a gap between my generation and that load, and so it's what is the best power generator to build in that gap? And that's pretty straightforward. Well, now, and I didn't have to worry about location. I could just sort of think about it in a sort of meta way. Now, actually, location actually matters. Where I put the power plant matters. What the transmission system looks like matters. All this other policy stuff matters. And the bidirectional power flow matters. So how I plan this system for the future is going to be huge. So I need economists. I need folks that understand how to do sophisticated probabilistic modeling. I badly need people who understand statistics, and I did quantum mechanics in a previous life. I need quantum mechanic minded people, actually, because that's what a lot of this stuff is about. And so that's kind of from the utilities perspective what we need. But then I need policy folks and economic folks that can think about how do we take the existing business models and shift them in such a way that all of the participants can find value out of what we're doing, and consumers still get low rates and reliable power, right? And so, I know I'm kind of being really broad for Charles' questions, but that's really the point. You need people all across the spectrum right now in order to be able to solve this. This is a really cool place to be, particularly if you want to work on hard, gnarly problems that actually make a difference. Because as I said, we can't survive without the power system operating. And we probably can't survive if we keep operating the power system the way we're operating it over the long run. So it's a great place, I think, for folks to be. Yes, sir.
And before David jumps in, we got over 50 people online. So if you're online and you think you have a question, feed that in, and we'll feed that to Joe here in the room.
Yeah, this is great talk. And what comes across so clearly is the complexity of the system. So I want to get your view on another aspect of the complexity. You mentioned electric vehicles, how to charge those vehicles, how to deliver the energy to those vehicles, whether it's a long-haul truck that needs a lot of electricity or a lot fast, or whether it's someone who lives in an apartment building who doesn't have a place to charge, or whether it's just the business model for public charging at all. What are your thoughts on how those problems might be solved, and how that affects the sale of electric vehicles and the rate of expansion of that market, and so on and so on?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I want to give an example or two, but let me come up a level for a second. What you're talking about is a new dimension for us that we really have never had to deal with the utility, which is customer choice and what people, the decisions they want to make on how they're going to use their electricity. So take electric charging, for example, right? Me as a good utility person would like to say, well, the best place for me to put a charger is right here, and I want you all to show up and charge your car between this hour and that hour, right? That's exactly how I'd like you to do it. There's not a one of you in here is going to do that. So, but I don't understand how you're going to do it. So just the social science around how people make that decision. And we have a huge ongoing debate inside my organization about how are you all going to charge. I'm a believer that, yes, there will be a segment of the market that will charge at home in the evening. But I'm a believer we're all creatures of habit. We forget what to do. And so I think we're all still going to go to Weigel's at 8 o'clock in the morning, which is not when I want you to charge. And you want a fast charger at 8 o'clock while you're in getting your cup of coffee, and you want to be gone in, 5-10 minutes. So that's what I think is going to happen. I have a contingent in my group who thinks, no, we're all going to come home. We're going to be good citizens. We're going to plug in at night, charge exactly when the electric utility comes. And we'll give you a discount in that electricity if you do it then. Except what they've shown is that unless the discount's like this big, nobody really pays attention to it. So how do I get you to pay attention to it if that's the case, right? So that whole dimension right now is a really interesting place that we don't really have a good answer for. And if I move beyond that and I go to, let's say, truck transportation, right? So Pilot's a good example. They're trying to figure out how are they going to deal with truck transportation and how are they going to charge. Well, there's a lot of interesting issues that come up there. First of all, if you think about, let's forget Pilot, let's go to Buc-ee's. Everybody here been to Buc-ee's? All right. So you see how many pumps are at Buc-ee's? I make all those electric, right? Buc-ee's is now a 500 megawatt load for us, right? And we're going to have one of those. What is it? You see the signs about every 150 miles down the road. So that right there for us is like, whoa. And on top of that, Buc-ee's wants to go where there's an intersection where there's nothing around it, right? Which means there's no electrical infrastructure, right? On a big interstate. And they want us to pay to put all that power into them. So we got to figure out how all that. But then they've done tons of science on how we think and particularly how truck drivers think. So I don't know about Buc-ee's, but I know Pilot. They know if you're a truck driver, you come in and you pull in and you're going to fuel. You want to be there 38 minutes. And in that 38 minutes, you're going to fuel that truck. You're going to take a shower. You're going to call home. You're going to buy dinner. And you're going to get back in the truck and you're going to be on your way. So that's how they want to charge. They got to charge a full truck in 34 minutes. And they're going to do that 24/7. And if they don't, trucking companies are going to go do something else because they'll lose money, right? So I don't know that I answered your question because I'm not sure I can, but it's that right there in and of itself is a huge challenge that we don't know yet how to address.
And it's one that's essential if the electric vehicle market is going to really expand.
Yeah, I think to me right now, that's one of the problems why it's cooling back off is that the range anxiety is a big problem for folks. Whether it's perceived range anxiety or real range anxiety, because both are out there, it's a problem. And we're a long ways away to really remedy that. Lots of good things going on, but a long way to remedy that.
Thanks very much.
All the professors are asking me questions. You all got to have some questions too.
Hey, Joe, I really appreciate the presentation, and I guess I had been wrestling a lot with what the FERC decision this week meant with respect to Talon, and your example of XAI creating its own system off the grid worries me that potentially, since a lot of these purchase power agreements that we've seen over the last month have been for future power plants that aren't built yet on the nuclear side, if that effectively is going to destabilize the grid in the future, because rather than connecting to the grid, you're going to build all this power supply and obviously all the excess heat and energy wastage that's not going to be connected to the grid. So any thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, that's a hard one because if I give you what I think is the right technical thing, then I'm the bad utility because I don't want people to have freedom, right? But the reality is the way we built the system is we socialize all this cost. So if you have a big load, that's okay. You get that piece of it, but the rest of us get the value of whatever energy you're not using whenever you're not using that, right? And so then it sort of lays out. But if you get the whole thing, nobody else gets it in here, but I have to pay for my costs and everything associated with you, but then I got to go over here and duplicate it so that I can take care of everybody else. Then pretty soon I'm now shifting costs in the wrong place. First of all. Secondly, I'm creating these weird nodes technically in the grid that I'm not saying we can't manage them, but it's not the way we think about managing them at this point. And so that may require changes to the grid system, which again, we're all going to pay for. So I think there's probably a way to accomplish what they're doing, but you got to get the people that have to deal with the technical side, the people with the regulatory prowess, and a business model together and work through it. And part of the challenge right now is just pace, right? These folks want to move so fast that none of these other things can keep up.
Great talk. I was wondering if you have any real examples that your team and you have proposed to account for the safety and the distribution of energy here in Tennessee, or any examples that you have done in the past and worked, or people were scared because they're like, oh, this is not safe enough, we're not implementing it.
not sure I fully understand your question, but we're looking at a lot of the different technologies and how they would fit, into our grid system. When we go out and we talk to different stakeholders, different communities, they all have different opinions about what they think is the most valuable technology, what's the safest technology, right? So we're actually kind of blessed in the Tennessee Valley. Most everybody in the Tennessee Valley likes nuclear, right? I mean, I think but you go to other parts of the country and nuclear is not a good thing, right? They don't care much for that. Solar is an interesting one. I was talking with some students at lunch is, everybody thinks solar is good, and it is, but its capacity factor is kind of low, and so that's why utilities, it's difficult for us to see the value of. But now it turns out that there's a number of environmental groups, particularly wildlife groups, that are like, well, solar is just using up habitat. So we don't really want you to use the habitat. So to give an example, one of the things we've been working on is how do we create a habitat in a solar farm, right? So we've done a lot of work with pollinators around our right-of-ways in our transmission system. Now we're trying to figure out how do I apply that in a solar farm, for example. I don't know if I'm really answering your question or not.
Yeah, you did. I was watching the talk and I was like, well, what would be an example of that? Like you applying all these like concepts that you presented.
Well, and anybody that comes into with a new technology into the grid, our grid people are like, yeah, this is not going to work, right? So you have to really work with them to get them to understand, because one, it's a new technology, right? So they don't fully understand it. And so you have to help them kind of understand it. So my team does a lot of demonstrations. Like I mentioned the battery plant out here. That's part of the reason we're doing that, is to get the folks inside the company as much as outside comfortable with the technology, that it will actually work for us and do the things that we would like it to do. We have a project going with the lab in Middle Tennessee Electric where we're putting in it's a energy management system, but it's not like your Nest thermostat. Nest thermostat's all about individuals, let you do what you want. This is an energy management system that actually the utilities manage. And so like if there's an outage, they can take your neighborhood and they can group it together and you can operate it as a microgrid while the power gets restored, that kind of thing. So we're actually doing that in a neighborhood over in Middle Tennessee to get consumers comfortable with the fact that, there's this management system hooked onto their house.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't have a lot of knowledge about this subject. I'm just interested in it. I don't have a lot of knowledge about the way you use nuclear energy, but I am aware that there are small modular reactors being developed. How do you see that as part of integration in your energy model?
Yeah, good question. So we're convinced, and I think this is becoming a stronger view across most of the industry, if we're going to have a carbon-free future, we got to have nuclear in there. So the existing plants, all been there a long time, operating. So we got to have new kinds of plants. So what kind of new plants? Well, there's what they call an AP1000, which is sort of the same thing as the big ones we've got now. They're really big. They're 1,1600 megawatts, so they're huge. Those, when you put a load, whether it's a generator or a load that big and you put it on the system, it's hard to manage, particularly if I got a lot of renewables, because I want to be able to balance those two sources. And those big nuclear generators, they don't want to balance. They just want to run. Small modular reactors, much smaller. So think 300-400 megawatts. And it now can help complement things like solar much better. So you can put a few smaller ones on the grid at the same time. Because they're smaller and because of the way they're designed, they're inherently safer. They don't have the potential for meltdown and that kind of things that you see in the large plants. They have what's called passive safety systems. In other words, you don't have to have external motors and pumps and all kinds of things to keep it safe. It just does that naturally. So there's some huge value in there. And so trying to get those developed is really important. The challenge is the costs are still very expensive. And the regulatory timeline working with the NRC is still extremely long and complicated. So we're working on a project out here at Clinch River where we're trying to install an SMR, but it's way more expensive because it's a new technology and it's nuclear than anything we would normally do. You've got to get through that curve where you figure all the problems out and you get that all sorted out so that then you can mass produce them and the costs get much cheaper. And we're kind of stuck in that hurdle as an industry trying to figure out how to get over that. We are. Problem is, the numbers are astronomical. It's like, we're talking $5-6 billion to build one of these first ones. And it's like nobody has, well, apparently Elon Musk has that much money, but beyond him, there's not very many people that have that much money. So there is a program actually through DOE right now, and we're applying on a grant from there that'll at least get us started. It's about $2 billion total.
So you talk about the transition as a decentralization of this legacy system that we've had. And I'm kind of curious about your views about the advantages of sitting in a traditional electric utility setting here in this part of the country versus a restructured system. Of course, might help if you explained to everybody what that meant, but I'm kind of curious about how you view the opportunities and the urgency of planning versus a more decentralized transition that might be possible elsewhere.
Yeah, I probably have a bit of a contrarian view on some of that because so just for everybody else in the room, the lots of categories as I mentioned earlier, but if I kind of simplify that down, you have vertically integrated utilities, which are utilities that generate the power, transmit the power, and deliver the power. We sort of do that. We have 153 distribution companies, but we're their regulator, and so we're sort of vertically integrated. Then you have other places that are markets. So one company owns the grid, maybe multiple companies owns the generators, and then you have a market function that coordinates how you buy and sell and do all that stuff. And everybody now is trying to figure out, how do I now take all that and I translate that down to putting stuff at the distribution level. So in other words, putting small generators, say here at the, we could put one right out here at the Baker Center and you could operate it versus that other bigger market. And I'm actually of the view of decentralization is actually going to happen, but not everywhere. Because it doesn't need to happen everywhere. If I use TVA as the example, I have metropolitan areas like Knoxville, Nashville, Chattanooga that probably do need to have some decentralization. It creates greater reliability and resiliency, probably will reduce costs. But if I'm out here in the mountains of North Carolina, what I really need is good, reliable wires, and that's it. And I'm not a big enough grid to really buy power or own a power plant, right? I'll never make that cost effective. So there are people that are in those extreme camps. I got to decentralize everything. And there are other people that want to, the old way's good, don't mess with it. And I'm kind of in the middle. I think location is going to matter. And I think that for us now becomes the planning challenge. And we're proud of it. We plan the system, but we're over 7 states. We cover 2 time zones and probably 8 different geographies. And so it's like, man, what they need over here and when they need it is totally different than what they need up here and when they need it. And so we have to now figure out, how do I actually plan the system in a way that I can do locational kind of stuff and then tie it back together. I don't know if that got...
So Joe, I got a question online about hydrogen. So what role do you see hydrogen playing, both in terms of grid stability and energy storage? Is this something that you see as being useful for the grid overall? Is it useful in the TVA service region? Talk a little about where you see hydrogen going.
Yeah, so I actually think hydrogen is going to play an important role, particularly in the transportation space. I think when we think about, large shipping and large-scale trucking and that kind of thing, it's going to be a bit hard to get batteries, at least in any near term, to be able to last long enough with that big a load, and be size competitive. The challenge with hydrogen on the electric system is its inefficiency and its low energy density. So if say you use hydrogen for storage, if I can produce the hydrogen with a waste electricity, which is what they're talking about out west, which means when I say waste electricity, they have extra solar in the afternoon, right? They can feed that into hydrogen and then they can produce it and then they can burn it. When you burn that hydrogen though, it's super inefficient because it doesn't have much energy density in it. If you use electricity that's not free, if you will, to produce the hydrogen, it's like crazy. So an example, if I took a gas turbine that TVA has, and it's about 150 megawatts, if I mix a 50-50 mixture 70 mixture, 30% hydrogen, 70% gas, and I burn that, right? That 30% hydrogen takes the generation output from that unit, that entire unit, to produce it. So if you think about that for a minute, I'm taking, just for 30% of the hydrogen, I'm taking all of the energy that unit produces to make that hydrogen. That means I'm in the hole by 30%, right? And so it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to just simply burn it in a gas turbine. Now, that said, there's some really cool work that's being done on fuel cells, and fuel cells are much more efficient, but nobody's been able to get fuel cells up to the kind of scale that we need to have them for our kind of power generation. So if you want to work on something, that's actually a really cool area to work on is fuel cells. Because if we can make those work, hydrogen would be really good at that point. But right now, I think because of that, it's going to be in the transportation sector. But I think it's going to play an important role in the transportation sector. And maybe manufacturing. That's the other thing, is hydrogen's used in a lot of places in manufacturing that'll be important.
Thanks so much for your talk. I had a lot of questions, but maybe one to pick up on Tim's question. I like the graph that you showed about kind of the patchwork of electric utilities and talking through the different regulatory structures. You talked a little bit about investor-owned utilities. And I'm curious what similarities you see within investor-owned utilities, and then also how we can think about what different opportunities exist in the TVA region.
Yeah, so for TVA, we're public power. I think from a business model standpoint, right, we derive our revenue from two places. One is the rates, and one is we borrow debt on the bond market, and we have a debt ceiling of $30 billion. If I compare that now to an IOU, right, they get their funding basically from two places, right? They get it from rates. The rates for them are regulated through the PUC, so they have to go ask to whether or not they can raise the rates. And then they get the investment from private investors, right? And so when you look at that, we're similar to one another. Where we end up differing is the drivers then about what you do and why you do it, right? Because at the end of the day, their investment capital is critically important, just like it is to everybody, but it comes from those private investors, right? Their number one metric is the return on the investment for that capital. So everything they do drives that. Even when they go to the PUC and ask to do programs, right? Everything they do, they will try to figure out how, or I shouldn't say everything, but a lot of what they will do, they will try to figure out how to make it capital aligned. Because if it's capital, they can pass that they can pass a percentage of that through the rates that allows them to pay their investors an interest rate. If it's not capital, they can't do that. On our side, we don't have that driver. So we make decisions more around what's best for the system for TVA and what's best for the local community and regions, which I actually think is a benefit over the IOUs. The challenge, however, is we got that $30 billion debt cap, right? That debt cap was set in 1979. So if you just did the rate of inflation, it ought to be a tad bigger than that, right? But that really limits what we're able to do and how we're able to do it. I'll stop there. There's probably we could have a long conversation about that. If you can't notice, I like public power. I think that's a good business model. I have a lot of friends that are in IOUs, but I like the public power model. And I hate markets. That's a whole nother conversation. You and I got to still have that conversation. I've been in multiple panels up at DOE where they've tried to get me to explain why markets were much better than TVA, and me and Southern Company sit next to each other and go, yeah, no.
Hey, so I guess I had more of a technical question. When you were talking about battery development, you mentioned like failed attempts in Arizona to incorporate lithium-ion batteries on the larger scale.
Yeah.
Do you think that technology is still viable and just needs time for energy storage, or do you think we should look towards other forms of energy storage to incorporate into a larger grid?
Yes. So they're, as they've learned, right? So they're shifting the chemistries a little bit. So it gives them a better thermal window, and so that they won't burn down as much. The other thing we're figuring out is that what lithium-ion batteries are really good for is about 4 hours across the peak. Right? If you make the batteries bigger than that, they get too expensive, and they have these operational issues get to be too big of a concern. So lithium-ion's good for about 4 hours. So we actually need batteries that last longer than 4 hours, right? For a lot of reasons. And so, yeah, other technologies are in development. So I put them in sort of 3 big buckets at the moment. One bucket is thermal technology, which is, I showed you all that waste heat, waste energy. Well, there's some people that are like taking advanced ceramics, and you run that waste heat through it, and the ceramic absorbs the heat, right? And then over time that builds up, and then when you need it, you can put cold air back through it and take the heat back out and create, so it's a thermal battery. There's this really cool concept that's been around for a while. It's called a gravity battery. It's real simple, right? You lift something up in the air, creates potential energy, let it back down, right? And there's actually some big ones of those being built around the world, like 50 megawatt, 100 megawatt. And then there's chemical batteries. So they're flow batteries where basically it's a fuel cell kind of thing where you're running 2 chemicals and they transfer an electron across the membrane. And then a new one, which is really kind of interesting, it's called, I call it the rust battery. But basically it's taking water and iron and you're making it rust, but only so far as then you can reverse that and turn it back into iron. That's been around for a really long time. Why it's never been used is it's also not very efficient. It takes up a lot of space. If you're going to put it in a car, it's not good at all. But if you're going to put it like for a utility, land is not as big a deal, and so you could do that. So there's a lot of work going on in there. They're all in development. They're not there yet, but that's where they're headed. So I think we'll have lithium-ion, still have pumped storage, and then we'll have some of these others, depending on how they fully evolve.
This is usually the point where the speaker looks over at me and they're like, when are you going to call them off and let me go home? I'm pretty sure Joe could do this all day.
You told me what time,
so let's take one more question and then we'll let Joe off the hook, okay?
Yeah, Joe does need a drink, so.
Yeah.
So my question relates to the existing grid that probably isn't going away or at great cost, and innovation. And is there a way, like in other engineering systems, they have things like APIs that kind of acts as an interface that as long as you bring something that looks like this, I'll take it away and use that. Is anyone working on like I have a new power generation technology that freaks out the grid guys? Is there a way? Is anyone working on systems that would make that compatible so it could just plug into the grid just like a generator emulator, if you will, because they like the grid engineers like that.
Yeah, so two parts. The short part of that answer is there's a IEEE policy that was been developed over the last decade called 1547, which is effectively that, right? This is the kind of architecture you got to have in order to plug into the grid. So that's the easy part. The hard part goes back to that patchwork I showed. The reality is not only are we in a policy, we all build our systems different, right? So our system's built all around 161 and 500 kV transmission systems. Southern Companies is 79 and 564, something like that. They're multiples. So it's a different system, right? So you can't just, right? And then every company that builds the new widget, it's got their own proprietary thing. So we're trying, in fact, that pilot I talked about in Middle Tennessee we're doing, that's one of the requirements there. It's open source. So every sensor, everything that plugs into that has to apply to that open source. That's the future. That's actually where we need to go, but we're a long ways away from that, unfortunately.
So Joe, all of our students are this intelligent and this engaged, so you should be ready to have this conversation every week when you teach your class. Also, if you're interested in the class, please come talk to me. Either this class, the certificate program, you can grab me, you can grab Tim, you can even grab Joe and ask him. We can set you up with who you need to talk to. I don't know very many people that can jump between the technicalities of hydrogen fuel cells and an investor-owned utility this seamlessly, so this is a real treat. Join me in thanking Joe Hoagland one more time.
Thanks.